The Citroen car company was started in 1919 by André Citroën. He was an engineer, a brilliant engineer. First thing he did when he went into business was set up a gear making factory. And this, rightly or wrongly, it may be apocryphal, but it is said that he discovered the double helical gear, which was where you've got the two angled gears locking into each other, which was a big leap forward in the engineering world, gave smoother, quieter operations for gearboxes. And of course the double helical gear became the double chevron symbol of the Citroen factory and remains so to this day. Citroen made from 1919, well, the first was the Type A, which was a conventional car in appearance, but it was the first time that a car was sold to the public complete. Because previously you didn't buy a car, you went and bought a chassis and then you took it to a specialist coach building company and had a body mounted on it. After the Type A came the Type B, with improvements to engine, improvements to body, different body styles. And then in 1922 we had the small car, the 5CV, or the Type C, which, like the Austin 7 in the UK, was the car that brought motoring to the masses.
This is a very early Citroen. It's one of the prototypes of the 5CV, probably built for the Paris Motor Show in October 1921. I think Citroen were trying to get a big corner of the market with economical cars. They had a bigger car on the market at the time and they wanted a small, attractive, economical car. And they aimed it particularly at women because it's very easy to drive, it's very simple. Instrumentation is incredibly simple. It's only got two instruments, an ammeter and a light switch. It's a 3-speed gearbox. It's not got synchromesh, so obviously you've got to double D-clutch when you change gear. It's got the accelerator in the middle, which a lot of vintage cars, in fact most vintage cars did have in those days. The wheels are, although they aren't solid, they have got inner tubes in them, although they've got discs on. It has rear wheel brakes and a transmission brake, which usually work quite well. Top speed's probably about 45, though I am told I've touched 50 once. But normally I cruise it at about 35, 40, and it'll do that all day quite happily. It's got a little idiosyncrasy whereby it throws itself into a shudder every now and again, which is a bit alarming, particularly for people behind you, which is just to do with the alignment of the front wheels. This very car we knew about for quite some time before we were able to buy it. Always hankered after it because it's a very pretty little car, and I've had it for about 25 years now. I like to keep the car as it is. There are a lot of very restored cars about, but when you get something as original as this, I think it's nice to keep it that way as long as you can. 90% of it is original. The bonnet catches aren't, and the seat that I'm sitting on, the rest of it I think is original. They were usually painted in this yellow. They were known for it. It was the Citroën pressé, which was the pressed lemon colour that they were known for. I think having a ducktail bottom makes her very French. I don't think there are many English cars that have got quite that elegance. I once had her referred to as a delightful little pram. So she was known as the Pram for a while. I'd say this car was definitely female because she's very pretty, she's very elegant.
Citroen's strength in France initially was more because of his flair for publicity and what we would now call marketing. Of course, he was also a great showman. He had the name Citroën written up in lights on the Eiffel Tower. In the 20s and the early 30s, Citroen's policy with models was to improve underneath, improve the mechanicals, not so much the bodies in body parts. In fact, if you look at Citroens of that period, in some ways it's very difficult to tell exactly which model you're looking at, whether it's a C4 or a C6 or whatever, because many of the body panels were carried on from one car to the next. People were waiting for something new. And of course in 1934 he produced the Traction Avant, or the 7 as it was known in France, a completely new car, which was the technological breakthrough which really set Citroën ahead of all the other manufacturers and has done ever since.
Well, of course, when it came out in 34, it caused them all sorts of financial problems, and a year later or so, they were broke, went bust, and André Citroën died as a result of the stress that caused. The company's biggest creditor was Michelin, the tyre people, and they took over the business and carried it on and got the car right, technically and reliable, and it just went from strength to strength. Tremendous. It was advertised as being well ahead of its time, and of course it was. It was a completely new concept. Prior to those days, all cars had chassis and running boards, and they had wooden bodies that were skinned in metal. And this, of course, was the first monocoque, totally made out of steel, like today's modern car. It also had torsion bar suspension like modern Porsche. It had hydraulic brakes all round, and a very nice four-cylinder overhead valve engine, which I think was one of the first into mass production. It's a tremendous car to drive, of course. It's very modern in its technique, even though it's 1939. It drives very straight, the steering superb. It's a quiet car on the road. The road holding is tremendous because it has a low centre of gravity. The top speed's around the 80, but it'll cruise all day at 70 mile an hour and still give you around the 30 mile per gallon, which is, you know, for those days, pretty good, and not so bad for today for a 2-litre engine. The styling's Art Deco, and whichever way you look at it, it's great. I personally like the view from the rear because certainly the back of the car has lovely styling, and it's just absolutely right in my view. I took my driving test in a Light 15 saloon way back in a long time back. And in the early 50s, I did actually see a roadster, and there were not many of those around in those days, and I thought one day I'd like that. I did actually buy the saloon Light 15 in the 70s, and it took me another 4 or 5 years to find this car and restore it. But it's the sort of almost the love of my life. It's part of the family. She goes on holiday with us every year to the south of France, and she's never let us down yet. And that's some days when we've been doing well over 600 miles a day, you know, cruising at around the 65, 75. In glorious sunshine, she's fabulous.
Vive la traction.
Of course, there was no motor manufacturing during the war. The certain numbers of the Traction Avant were still running around, either commandeered by the Wehrmacht or used by the resistance. So come the end of the war, the French public in particular were waiting to see what Citroën were going to produce as their first post-war production car. And in 1948 they got it. They say 150 prototypes were made from 1936 onwards, of which all were destroyed at the outbreak of war, apart from 3, because they didn't want these prototypes to fall into the hands of the Germans. The 2CV, or Toute Petite Voiture, as it was originally called, was designed by Pierre Boulanger, and it was designed as a basic car for the countryman. The story goes that one of his criteria was that he should be able to get into it with his top hat on. The other one, that it should be able to take a basket of eggs across a ploughed field without breaking a single one. We've tried that, it does work. And it became the basic vehicle of France.
Well, the grey 2CV is a 1957 2CV, Type AZL, which is 425 cc's and is flat twin air-cooled, the same as the other two, but only has 12 horsepower, and then they increased it to 18 horsepower during its short life in the 50s. Well, the obvious thing to anybody is the bonnet. The early ones with the ripples and the side fluting was done away with in about 1961, and it brought in the modern bonnet. It was slightly more bulbous rather than more flowing straight across the front of the car. The canvas boot, that was very early on in the 2CV and up to about 56. Then the steel boot lid came in. The doors, of course, the earlier 50s doors are suicide type, opening from the front, and the seats have had numerous changes through the years. The untrained eye, they all look the same car. In Holland, it's known as the ugly duckling. It's very much a duck out of water, because on a motorway, it doesn't stand a hope in hell. If I'm using it on the road, I try and leave home very early and stay on the A roads rather than try and use the motorways. It's one of those cars which can always keep to the speed limit. It doesn't need to go any faster than 70, and if you do, well, you leave a few minutes earlier.
The 2CV, although marketed seriously at the very start, in Britain and indeed in Europe, was eventually marketed as a fun toy, as a kind of action man Barbie doll, even to the extent of you had brochures that not only contained cartoons, but in the final state of 2CV, a whole series of brochures and adverts which had Tintin characters in them, and the 2CV was actually acting out in these scenes. The Hello Dolly cars had eyelashes drawn on them, smiling faces, and the whole marketing of the 2CV was that the car was larger than life. It would make you laugh, it would make you smile, it would amuse your neighbours rather than amaze them. Interestingly, it was never marketed at the Whole Food, CND supporting Open Sandal Brigade, who in many cases bought them.
The cliché 2CV owner really only applies to Britain, I think, as perceived by the motoring public out there, and that is a bearded left-wing schoolteacher who wears a smock and reads The Guardian. If you go to any 2CV functions, you'll never see that animal there at all. Not in any great quantity. I think you'll find that in the fraternity of the 2CV there's a lot of green people, and I think a lot of green people think it's the nearest you can get to owning a car without actually going through the act of having one. The 2CV, with its fanatical following and its quirkiness, has become a car in itself because of its shape and what it represents. Nobody has a Citroen 2CV, they have a 2CV. The same as you have a Mini these days. You don't have a British Lane or an Austin or a Morris Mini, you have a Mini.
It can't have been economic for Citroens to carry on making it as long as they did. They kept saying they were going to drop it, and every time there was a terrific outcry. In the event, I think it was the economics and the advent of emission control and regulations and restrictions, so it was finally killed off, of course, in 1985.
In my short life as it is at the moment, the 2CV has taken me across America and across Canada and right through Europe, North Africa, Nordkap, Russia, Leningrad, Moscow. It's getting further and further, and next year is Northwest Australia.
There'd been speculation on Citroen's new car, but even the speculators of the press probably underestimated what would come.
This is a DS. It's called a DS because in French, DS means goddess. And it is, in terms of the motor car, a pure goddess. She's beautiful. The first time I saw the Citroen DS, I was about 11 years old. The car had been introduced a couple of years previously, and I was out walking with my father. We saw the new Citroen. It just was gliding along. We just had to stop and watch it slow down. And it stopped, and as the driver got out, the car raised itself up. As he shut the door, it sank down on its haunches. We waited while the driver came out of the newsagent shop, got back inside the car. It sunk down. As the engine started, it just lifted itself up. And with a purr, it was away. There was just nothing like it. No car had ever had such an impact. And from that day to this, I've loved them. The other cars in the street when I was that age, even though they were built after the war, the designs were actually pre-war. And then the DS came along. There was nothing like it. It was like a spaceship. What makes it so special, it is a British-built car, whereas the French cars would have had cloth seats and a plastic dash. That was too futuristic for the British motorist, so they were given such luxuries as leather seats and walnut dash. But even so, with all the verve of the French car. For the first time, hydraulics controlled every aspect of the car, not only suspension, but brakes, steering and gearbox. And it gave an absolutely constant ride. It was a magic carpet ride. Other cars, you could feel the bumps, you could be shaken about, but with the DS, It was like riding on a magic carpet.
Citroën, right from the start, were eccentric, innovative, and in their marketing have tried to reflect that. So that you get, for example, a DS Safari with a harp, a double bass, a trombone in the back. You get shots of children with balloons with Citroën logos on. You get strange figures with umbrellas walking through Citroën brochures. The whole marketing ploy was to make you amused, to emphasise a particular Gallic charm.
They were very complicated cars, and lots of people were totally frightened of them. It's often been known that these cars have been a plumber's nightmare. A normal car, shall we say, may have cost £500 or £600. A Citroën DS would have cost £1,500. It was very expensive.
Of course, the car did prove to be a success not only in the private ownership but in various rallying successes, particularly in the long distance, rougher rallies, which is a thing that Citroëns can continue to this day. Lately, Citroëns, of course, have got away from the quirky image. They are now into the mass production market with the advent of the BX. Nowadays, Citroëns are selling to your average car driver who doesn't realise the technological innovations that are under the bonnet of the car he drives. As far as he's concerned, it's a very good car for the job, it's comfortable, he has the performance he wants, he has the price he wants, all the other things that people look for when they're buying a new car. But probably a lot of the drivers don't realise the history behind it. Some of us do, some of us enjoy it, that's why some of us carry on still driving the cars.